My name is Matt Gordon. I am joined by Kuhn Bremer. We are representing the taxi team of the gentlemen in the fourth row, Doug, Timon, Mike, and George and Truitt. And we'd like to thank, before we get started, our sponsors from the city, from Katie from the EDC, Dawn from the TLC, Eugene from the city, as well as Sid from Bell Labs, who really helped us out with a lot of the technology, and John from Accenture, and the professors. So our team was tasked with speeding up the wait lines at JFK Airport. This is something that a lot of people have probably either experienced firsthand, heard about anecdotally, or read in the Wall Street Journal this semester. One of the challenges we faced in this class was, with this task, was really understanding the extent of the problem. There's very limited data that is available. One study, which we did reference, was done at Terminal 5 JetBlue, which showed that average passengers' waits were about 9 minutes long, with about 20% of passengers waiting over 15 minutes. But there's also really peak periods of time during the day when that wait can exceed an hour long. So about 7, 8 in the morning when a lot of flights come in, early afternoon, in the evenings. And this is also a big problem when there's bad weather. When it's rainy, a lot of cabs stay in the city and don't come out to the airport. But there's also another side to this problem as well, and that's a lot of times cabs are also waiting at the airport when there's no passengers arriving, whether it's also bad weather situations. The cabs can end up waiting in the central taxi lot, which I'll explain in a second, for over 2 hours themselves. So there's really multiple sides to this problem, and understanding it and working through solutions was our challenge this semester. To do so, we spent a lot of time talking to the multiple stakeholders involved. So that ranges from the Port Authority, who owns and oversees the airports, to the dispatchers, who they contract out the taxi operations, the airlines, the terminal operators, as well as TLC, the EDC, and as well as other parties that have also looked into this issue. So we worked with the City University and to help use the reports that they've done as well. So really trying to bring a lot of the work that's gone into this and really best understanding how we can provide recommendations going forward. So quick overview of our findings, and to better understand what our solutions are going to be, where we'll spend most of the time, I'll give you a quick overview of the process. So when a cab arrives at the airport, it goes to the central taxi hold lot, which is basically like a pooling system. So instead of going directly to terminals, they go to this lot, line up in the order in which they arrived, where they wait until a dispatcher at each of the terminals radios the central taxi hold and calls for the cabs to then go to the specific terminal. Before going to that terminal, the cab pulls up to a little booth where they're given a ticket, which informs the driver which terminal to go to. When that cab then arrives at the terminal, it gives that ticket to a dispatcher to ensure that that cab properly waited online. These dispatchers also have a lot of other responsibilities, such as talking to all the passengers, finding out where they're going, because if they're not going on a $45 set fare to Manhattan, then they'll get a short return ticket, meaning they come back to the central taxi hold lot and cut the line, so that this way they're incentivized to come to the airport and not just have to run the risk of getting a $10 fare to a local stop in Brooklyn. So dispatchers. And so there's multiple problems that we've identified with this current process. One being the regular operation. So this is what we define as a time when there's plenty of cabs at the airport and plenty of passengers. There's periodic waiting times. Sometimes it can get close to an hour long. Other times there could be no wait at all. And a lot of our solutions focused on this area are the improvements that could be made to the current process. There's also the irregular operations, which mostly occur during the inclement weather, basically when there's no cabs at the airport, so passengers are stranded. And a final challenge we had is that there's multiple stakeholders involved in the operations of the taxis and the airports, and it's dispersed accountability, and I think all the parties would agree there's not as much communication as could be effective. So there's also that third bucket which we wanted to address in coming up with our solutions.
Yeah, so to tackle those, I'll use the computer. So to tackle those problems, we've basically developed a very broad set of solutions that contains both short-term proposals and more long-term proposals. And we've tried to divide them in broadly 3 categories. First of all, we think that there are sort of roughly 3 systematic improvements that can be made that sort of touch the whole process of getting people into cabs and reducing the wait line. We also think that there are a couple of specific solutions that relate to the matching process. So that's really what the dispatcher does in getting one person into a cab. And finally, we think there are some things that can be improved on the supply and demand side. So how can we increase the supply of taxis, or at the same time decrease the demand for taxis at peak time? And our first and I think most far-reaching proposal is to increase the utilization of the GPS technology that is already in the cabs today. So by increasing this and by being able to track the cabs while they're at the airport or around the airport, we think that eventually it's possible to eliminate the need for shorties or to eliminate the need for the exchange of tickets at all. And in that way, you can sort of free up the dispatcher to focus on really getting the passenger into the cab. So this is a technology that's already in the cabs. So the GPS is already there, but it's not really being used. It's also technology that is already used in other airports. So we think it's definitely possible to do this. And it solves a number of the problems that we've seen. And on top of that, it creates sort of an information base, because if you know how many cabs come in, how many cabs go out, etc. If you have an exact database there, it's easier to create improvements later on. And we think that sort of a $1 million investment in basically in software development, so not so much in hardware, but mostly in software, would be needed to implement this. Secondly, as Matt just mentioned, like the real excessive waiting times usually happen in sort of irregular operations, and that's mostly when it rains. So we propose to introduce a so-called IROP, or Irregular Operations Policy, that aims at reducing demand, streamlining matching, and increasing the supply, so that even when it rains, everybody will be happy. Couple of suggestions on what should be included in a policy like that is something on diverting passengers by noting the waiting time, so they will choose other transportation opportunities. Suspend the shorty issuance during irregular operations. Enabling the taxis to bypass the central taxi hold. So instead of going through the taxi hold and then go to the terminal, be able to go to the terminal directly. And finally, to enable the delivery cars or the black cabs to pick up passengers at the terminal. Finally, we've also thought about sort of how to improve not so much the waiting time, but maybe the experience once people get into the cabs. And we've mainly thought about IDs around the screen in the back of the cab. One thing you could think of is maybe a translation service where foreign tourists can sort of be helped in communicating to the taxi driver. Maybe a Yelp-like service where people can orient on where to go in the city while they're in the back of the cab. I think there's a bunch of things that could be done here. So on the matching, so really once a passenger gets to the front of the line and needs to get into the cab, we think there's a number of things that can be done. First of all, better alignment of the schedule of arriving flights with the schedule of the dispatchers. So you can make sure that on the sort of expected peaks in demand for cabs, that are always two dispatchers available. On top of that, we propose to install arrival screens at each terminal, so that the dispatchers can sort of anticipate what flights are coming in and how many passengers they will need to have seated in cabs. Taking that a step further could be to install a camera that sort of sends a video feed of the line to the central taxi hold, so that the central dispatcher can allocate cabs according to what he literally sees, and in that way sort of relieving the dispatcher of that task. Communicating wait times, as you all know, like waiting 5 minutes for the subway is not the worst thing, as long as you know, or as long as there's a sign that says it's going to be 5 minutes. So similar thing could be done at the taxi hold, or sorry, the wait line. And finally, not only sort of rescheduling the dispatchers, but also maybe considering adding extra dispatchers at the peaks that can be expected beforehand. Also, our study shows that I think the best dispatcher that's around is actually 35% faster than the average dispatcher. So we think that there's a lot of best practices that could be transferred from sort of the very good dispatchers to the average dispatchers. And we think that it's something that can be started immediately and could basically be done through training, but could have like a very significant impact. Another thing we thought about is sort of redesigning the queue. At this moment, it's if you're waiting for a cab at JFK, it's one line that leads to one point where there's one dispatcher getting you into a car. And what you see here is the sort of queuing process at Whole Foods, where there's multiple lines leading to multiple service stations. And then there's a screen, you see it there in the middle, it sort of shows you what service station you can go to. And we think that a similar technique could be applied at JFK, even though it's maybe not possible at all the terminals because of sort of curbside physical constraints. Maybe there's not the room for this, but at least we think that this is an idea that could be implemented. Then on the supply side, sort of how can we thought about how can we get taxi drivers to JFK when there's a shortage of cabs, and these are just some ideas, but maybe sort of improving the restrooms or the restaurant facilities, or maybe even having a gas station that offers sort of preferential gas prices, or does an oil change whenever there are cabs needed. And finally, we think that sort of in regulating demand for cabs, we think that a lot could be done in improving the communications to the travelers, sort of indicating what options they have to get from JFK to the city, by a cab or by the air train, maybe take a shuttle, and also indicate sort of how long each one is going to take, so that if there's a long wait line for the cabs, that people have the option to take another means of transportation. Finally, talking about the potential impact, it's of course very hard to very precisely quantify what these solutions could sort of bring. But we think there's an impact in several ways. First of all, a lot of our proposed solutions will have more of an intangible impact, focusing on the experience or managing the passenger expectations. But on top of that, for instance, on the matching side, we've seen that improving the time it takes to get a passenger into the car by only 10% will increase the throughput by almost 60 cabs per hour. And we believe that implementing the solution that we propose, this is definitely attainable. Same thing on the supply and demand side. We believe that sort of with the things we propose, that it's possible to increase the supply by 15 to 20 cabs per hour, and at the same time to decrease the demand for cabs by 15 to 20 cabs per hour. Sort of how do we think this can be implemented? I think that the very next step is to build working groups around these solutions, and select a champion for each one of them. Then start by implementing the sort of short-term things that we proposed, a lot of the quick wins that we talked about before, to get sort of a quick result. And as a next step, to report these results to all the stakeholders to show that actual improvement is possible. And then based on that, to start implementing the more longer-term solutions like the GPS stuff that we proposed. And at the meantime, sort of keep an open view, talk to other airports about how they tackle these problems, to maybe generate more ideas. So that was it. Thank you very much.